So we're going to get started with our tips for fall garden cleanup. And I guess Jenny said this is our last of our summer series of our lunch and learns. And so we're getting to provide some tips for what to be doing in the upcoming months here. So again, our program is here in Thurston County. And we have some partners here. Our office is housed in the WSU Extension Thurston County Extension office here at the Thurston County Fairgrounds. And we have two programs that our volunteers are part of as part of our extension program, which is the Master Recycler Composter Volunteer Program and the Master Gardener Program. And both of those programs are heavily volunteer based. We provide trainings each year, and then typically we do outreach activities in the community. Unfortunately, with COVID, we haven't been able to do it that way, so we decided to do these virtual lunch and learns instead. Jenny will, at the end of the presentation, will provide more information about how to hear about other kind of upcoming virtual presentations in the future. So again, our program focuses on gardening, composting, recycling, and information and answering client questions. And again, the client can be anybody here within Thurston County. Virtual presentations have a much farther reach beyond, but traditionally when we do our other types of volunteer service, we're normally answering questions just from residents of Thurston County. We have 3 demonstration gardens, which we demonstrate best practices. And so we have our first garden down at the Olympia Farmers Market Garden, which is just east of the actual market itself. We have our closed loop park garden, which is out at the Thurston County Waste and Recovery Center in Hawks Prairie. And we have our Dirtworks demonstration garden, which is in Yager Park in West Olympia. All 3 of these gardens, I'm going to highlight different fall gardening tasks from these gardens in today's presentation. Unfortunately, the Dirtworks is not open currently to the public. But work is still being done in the garden from our volunteers. We also have our food bank garden that's in operation there as well. Closed Loop and Olympia Farmers Market Garden are open. Farmers Market is open. There is no restrictions since it's in a public space. Closed Loop, you do need to follow the hours of the Waste and Recovery Center, and that can be found on their website. Okay, so as we're getting into fall, you might be seeing some of these garden tests. You maybe at the end of your vegetable beds are coming to the end of their growing season. Your fruit trees and that maybe have already produced a bunch, or if not, are going to be ready for harvest here shortly. And then comes the idea of what to do with all of this. After you actually harvest, what do you need to do? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on some vegetable practices, but also on other kinds of gardening tasks that need to be done. So let's dive right in. The one thing when preparing for this presentation, I realized is that it is a huge topic. There are plenty of fall garden tasks that can be done, and it can be almost overwhelming at times. And some tasks are easier, or I would say more enjoyable than others. And so I was thinking about a way that you could, within your family group, decide how you're going to go about doing your fall garden tasks. And so one fun way or suggestion would be to create a bingo card. And in each box, put a different fall gardening task. And then between you and your family members, decide how the best way for you to complete that task so that you can get bingo. So just like in a traditional bingo where you'd have all of them in a row, vertical or horizontal or diagonal. But maybe at that point, we could have like different, each player could have a different color pen, and you're trying to get, again, the most bingos there by accomplishing all of your fall garden tasks, but in a fun way. Today's presentation also is a general overview. We're going to provide follow-up resources, but you also know that on the internet, there's just, I mean, each of these topics could be a standalone presentation in itself. There's lots and lots of information on it. So just keep in mind, we're not going too far down a lot of the rabbit holes with fall garden cleanup. We're going to stay overall some general practices that are applicable for each of the major categories. So some general rules about cleaning up. If you have fruit trees or bushes, number one thing is you want to make sure that while you're harvesting, if there is fruit that has already fallen to the ground that is either diseased or damaged to the point where other insects or disease have gotten in, please don't compost that into your compost pile. Those diseases aren't readily killed off unless you get your compost piles at extreme higher temperatures. And some of them could be, but not all. And so without knowing 100%, you could actually, by putting the diseased fruit into your compost pile, that disease would then harbor within that compost all next year. And then you put out your finished compost in the spring next year and then spread that disease even more. So you do want to make sure that you do clean up that fruit there, but if it's diseased, again, that should go into the trash. And then if there is fruit that just was on the ground, but doesn't appear to be diseased, then yes, you can easily put that into your into your composting area to be composted. Other thing you want to do is making sure that our leaves haven't fallen off our trees yet, but they will soon be. So if you do have a lot of deciduous trees, to make sure you stay on top of the fall when the leaves fall, to actually be raking them up within reason. And we'll get to that when we get to the lawn section there too. So I'll touch back on that. But overall, there's certain areas that you definitely want to focus on making sure you clean up those leaves. Others you can be a little less concerned about. One little quick tip, that if you end up collecting a whole bunch of leaves, one easy way to get it into a finer mulch would be is to take those pile of leaves, put it into a trash can. Metal would be preferable. And then you could actually take your weed eater in there and like a weed whacker, and actually grind up kind of like a blender in order to get those larger leaves into a more finer consistency, especially if you have large volumes. That can help with, again, the volume of leaves that you have, and get it into a finer mulch that could be easily applied to the beds. Some other things to keep in mind too with cleaning and organizing your tools. In our follow-up email, we'll provide you with a couple videos that some of our master gardeners had put together on tool care, and also clean up here at the end, making sure that you want to clean your metal parts of your tools before you're putting them away, and making sure your wood handles are also protected as well by oiling them, and sharpened blades. And so I'm going to refer you to watching those particular videos that provide that information, that you can really dive into a little bit more details about what's best tool care for each tool. As far as, unless being used for winter gardens, you also want to clean up all of your stakes, your row markers, any garden art. With the temperatures that we get in the wintertime, sometimes your garden art can actually crack or break due to the temperature changes. So anything that that isn't pretty sturdy needs to be brought in and under some protected cover there. Clean and organize your bird feeders there. Right now, there's plenty of food for the birds, so you don't need to start feeding yet. But once the frost happens and that you could supplemental feed. The critical piece with bird feeders also is just making sure that you keep them clean. As you remember, you may or may not know, but earlier this last winter, we had an outbreak of some disease that actually caused some other effects of feeders being asked to be brought down or taken back inside. So we want to make sure that, again, we're doing our part by making sure that the bird feeders stay clean and sanitized for our bird friends. Other things to keep in mind for cleaning up is at the very end, when you're all finished with, let's say, your lawnmower or your weed whacker and that you make sure that, especially if it's gas powered, that you make sure that you either drain whatever, if there is any gas, or put in stabilizer in there, but also make sure that all your parks are clean. Look at the underside, make sure you clean out anything that might have been stuck to the underside of the mower itself. That's especially true if you have a mulching lawnmower. A lot of times things can get gummed up underneath, and that's not good overall to have that sit all winter long. If you used any kind of fertilizer equipment, you also want to spray that stuff out with water, make sure that everything is cleaned out. You don't want to have any residues or that left in any of the equipment. With your containers, like your decorative containers that you typically have for supplemental maybe areas of your property, like your decks and things like that, or front entryways, you want to be careful of weather sensitive pots. So especially if you have terracotta pots or unglazed pots, though, those tend to break easier in our colder temperatures. And so if that's the case, you want to either bring them in completely into like a garage space or a protected area, and then just keep out your maybe glazed pots that are more temperature sensitive there. And those containers there, you still want to make sure that they're in a protected space. So if you can back them against a wall or the side of your house, or in like an alcove area, that will also help make sure that those pots don't get cracked over the temperature changes there. If you do clean out your pots, a good way to do is make sure that all the soil's removed from them, and then you could do a part bleach and water solution. If you do choose to keep your soil left in your containers and you've removed all the plants, put down a layer on the top either of cardboard or plastic, and to hold that down to make sure that excess water doesn't saturate that soil. And that way you'll be a better start for next spring when you want to replant in that container. And next spring, we'll talk about even with a container that you've kept from previous years, there may be some roots that are still stuck in that soil, and also that you'll have to eventually remove. And then you may also have to supplemental feed, because as we know, annual plants are heavy feeders, and they tend to take a lot of nutrients out of the soil. And if you have a whole year's worth of growing in that one particular soil, you may have to supplemental feed with some extra nutrients and fertilizers for that to make sure that next year's growth grows well. And as I said, storm and protected area. So the other cool thing that you can do in the fall now is that even if you had annual plants on here that were from the summertime, you can swap them out with fall or early winter plants. And so right now, like our ornamental cabbages, some pansies, other things like that along the way are great fillers. Mums are a great way to swap out an annual plant with something that that's more fall or early winter festive. So yeah. Here's another example too. So this particular pot down here was all filled in. I had grasses in the back and annual plants in the front. And so now instead I swapped it out with some mums and also put in some other decorative fairy garden pieces or Halloween kind of theme pieces in order to make them more themed for the fall. So yeah, just looking at another way to repurpose your container plants there, so to make them multi-use for each season is another way to get the most bang for your buck and is more budget friendly as well. One thing that some folks always think about as far as a spring task is to get your soil tested, but actually the fall is another great time to get your soil tested. And they do recommend to get your soil tested every 2 to 3 years. Here in Thurston County, if you're interested in getting a soil test, you want to contact the Thurston County Conservation District. On their website, they have a page that explains how to actually take the soil test, and then also how to submit it, and then where they will send it off to the lab, and then how you'll get your results back. And then based on that results that you're going to get back, then you're going to amend your soils now and allow that to then work in naturally throughout the winter time. And so that's another way that you can, especially for larger projects, that can also be helpful, is to get a soil test here in the fall as well. And also one last thing about that is if you had manures too, if you stockpile the manures, it's best to do it now in the fall. So that way then you want to protect that manure by wrapping in a tarp, keeping it kind of protected so that the rain doesn't hit it and the nutrients don't run off. But that way that fresh manure will have time to kind of sit and rest, so that it'll be more easily used next spring. It'll have time to rest, so that way, again, it's not too fresh, and that potentially for young starts could burn those plants. And so we want to make sure that you have that proper time to have that mulch for that manure's resting. Another garden task that a lot of folks, this is probably one on the bingo card that you would probably have some more, not your first choice in order to get done for your fall tasks, is weeding. But it's critical to get those weeds weeded now here in the fall before they go to seed, because again, if those weeds if you've left them to seed, you're going to have that next spring, that more of weeds than you did here in the fall by just leaving them. So in order to help you next spring, do some weeding now, get those weeds out before they go to seed, and that way you'll have less weeds next spring. So you want to weed first, and then you're going to put down mulch. Your mulching options here in the fall are a great way to not only retain soil health by adding more nutrients to it. It also helps with moisture, but overall it's also a protectant too for the varying cold temperatures. So some options are compost, leaves, straw, wood chips. All of those are great options for different types of mulches that you might use on your different types of perennial beds or vegetable beds, depending on what you're using. Cardboard's another one that we use for our vegetable beds. So it just depends what you're looking at. Okay, you also want to dig, divide, and propagate. So the one critical piece that when you're going through and you're looking at all your beds right now in fall care is take note of any plant that is really struggled this year. And if you've had consistent years of this plant struggling and it's just constant disease there, then maybe that's not the best plant for that particular space. And this would be an opportune time to take it out. If you do take out a plant, though, you want to put mulch there if you're not going to immediately replant with something else, even though fall's a great time to actually plant new things. If you decide that you're just not sure yet about that space, put some mulch, and that way then that bed will stay as weed free as possible until next spring, until you decide what you want to do. But so again, if any of those plants are diseased there, again, dig them out, but don't compost them there. Another time is a great time is to dig up your plants. With a lot of our perennials, they just keep growing and growing, and eventually it's helpful if you actually divide them. So digging them back up, dividing them into smaller pieces, and then now you've got more plants and you can replant them in other areas or gift them to friends, or just have another way that you can help get the most bang out of your buck for those particular plants. Is a lot of perennials do this naturally, and so you take advantage of that. This is another great time to, as I said, to plant ground covers, trees, and shrubs. It allows the plant to actually establish itself all winter long. And so the only thing that I would say that if you are going to plant anything here still in September, we still have warm temperatures, and even in early October sometime, is that you want to make sure that those plants are well watered until the rains come. And when our fall rains come, then you can, lessen the amount of water that you're having to supplemental water with them. But in the meantime, just because you planted a new plant, make sure that you are still keeping up with that watering schedule until to make sure that it does establish itself well. Another thing to keep in mind is that with some of the plants, if you're digging and dividing, you can also trim some of them and also do stem cuttings for propagation. So you would take an actually cutting of the plant, and then you could learn different methods of actually propagating it from that stem. So we have a couple different publications on how to do stem propagation from stem cuttings. They go into great detail based on the particular plant variety. So again, I'm not going into details today, but we have follow-up resources that'll help you with that as well. So this was, let's see, 2019, since we didn't have anything last year. So this was at our closed loop garden. We actually, Closed Loop Park is known for our peony display. And this is one, we had a workshop on how to dig and divide your peonies at the end of the season, the growing season. And so this was a rather large peony that was end up being dug up and then divided into smaller pieces there. And so when you look at the plant itself, again, we have a number of peonies in this particular area there, and then dividing them out so that way you get the new plants there, and you can already see the new growth underground that's already starting for next year as well. So learning how to dig and divide is another way to get not only health of the plant, it helps it by spurring, again, by cutting it off and dividing that off, you've got new growth happening there, but also the fact that you get a lot of worth of, from that particular plant by separating it out and having new plants as well. We hope to have another of these types of workshops here in the future. We just have to, get through this COVID process right now, but after that, you'll be able to connect with us and through our listserv or our website. And then in the future, we hope to again be able to get back to our normal in-person workshop training schedule. Okay, pruning is one of the things that there are certain things that are good to prune in the fall, but really your major pruning should not be done in the fall. Pruning traditionally spurs new growth. When you cut something, it tells the plant, hey, I've got to make some extra energy here to reproduce and put out new shoots. So you don't want a lot of growth happening here in the fall when the plant is trying to go into its winter dormancy. So you have to be selective with what you prune. The other part we hear a lot about is that they did a pruning job now in the fall, not knowing that they actually cut off the buds for next year. And so for some, they did a big pruning job here in the fall, but then all of a sudden they realized, hey, I'm not getting flowers next year. Well, the reason why is because they cut them out. So a lot of plants set their buds for the next year right after they bloom. And so that's something to be aware of when you're pruning, is that be mindful and look at those stems and see if you can see where the buds have already been set for next year. Prune only what's necessary, leave the rest for winter feeding and interest. So this has kind of changed because over the years, initially, they talked about making sure your garden in the fall was very neat and tidy. Science has kind of changed, saying the fact that, yes, you want to have some things that are higher disease prone to be pruned out, but really the rest of it, you can actually keep it in a little bit longer. It also provides seeds for our birds and other types of pollinators, but also provides them sheltered space, and also provides us with winter interest. So if we had cut everything down to the ground, our gardens will look vastly different than they do now, where we leave a little bit left, behind. So yeah, it's kind of a neat thing to be able to say that I'm helping not only my, birds and pollinators, but also it's more visually pleasing for our gardens as well. So a couple of things you do want to make sure that you prune here in the fall. You prune your rose canes to about 2 to 3 feet. Remove any leaves and mound mulch around those canes. We have a whole separate fact sheet on rose care, and that's another one that's free and available on our follow-up materials here. If you have roses, on what to do. Your strawberry plants, you want to cut them back down to the crown. The one thing you could do, that if you end up having a runner, you could actually extend that runner and cover some soil over it, and that will grow a new plant. So if you're wanting to expand your current strawberries there, use a couple of those runners and put it under the ground and put some soil over it, and eventually that will become a new plant. But if you don't want to, if you want to kind of maintain it a little bit, then again, just cut back everything and then cut it back to the crown. That way the mound is still there, but it won't be necessarily producing a whole lot of other extra growth here in the wintertime. One other thing for what to prune, as I said, peonies are high disease prone as well as hostas. So once they flop over, it's good to prune them back. So that way, again, you have an inch or two above the ground, and that's it. Other than that, they can harbor not only disease, but also the slugs and snails will take over and bring other problems to your gardens as well. So those are another 2 examples of things that you can prune back here in the fall. That's good. Otherwise, it's up to you, or do some more research and by reading some of our other follow-up material. If you do find galls or cankers on your trees, don't prune until spring. Again, you don't want to be making large wounds now here in the fall, where that wound doesn't have enough time to secure itself or scab over. And if it's not fully scabbed over before winter starts, then disease can set in. So ultimately, the other thing is, by pruning it, sometimes it'll send that message to that tree, that they'll start to put out water sprouts, or those sprouting kind of branches out. And you don't want that necessarily here in the fall. One other thing to keep in mind right now, we've seen already gotten calls in our question and answer clinic, or not calls, I would say emails, because we're doing it virtually now. We've gotten a few emails about already, what is this? And so this particular thing you might be seeing in trees right now, or larger shrubs. And this is known as tent caterpillars. But actually right now what you're seeing is not tent caterpillars. Tent caterpillars actually happen in the spring. So this is what you would normally see in the springtime. And yes, this is the methods of managing it are both the same between this and what we are now seeing, which is called fall webworm. They are 2 different species. And so in the fall, you'll see these kind of netted areas over a tree or a large bush there. That's fall webworm. If you see the same kind of netting or tenting in the spring, then that is tent caterpillars. Within these webbings are hundreds of little caterpillars here. And this black stuff is actually their feces or poop that's left behind here. But they can chew through, as you can see here, these caterpillars really decimating this leaf here. The only thing is, though, if it's at a point where you can actually reach it, then yes, you can prune that entire branch out, and then you're going to throw that into the trash. Do not put it into your compost pile, okay? But if it's high enough in the tree, those are things you don't necessarily have to worry about. Another easy way to manage something is that if you can't actually, it's too high to prune, but you can get something enough to actually put a hole in this actual netting or webbing. What happens is, by making a hole in the webbing will allow yellow jackets to go in and actually feed on the caterpillars. So you have some options as far as natural predators in order to go in and to manage that and that outbreak as well. If it's still too high and you're not able to actually do anything of the above, then just leave it. Overall, they're not, one, just because you have it 1 year doesn't mean you're going to have it next year. The other thing is, just because you have it on a branch doesn't mean it's necessarily going to totally defoliate the tree. But it is something to keep in mind that if you have a whole bunch on a tree and it's lower where you're actually able to prune it out, then do so. Again, so tent caterpillars happen in the spring, fall webworm happens here in the fall. The other thing is, if you do have a big tree that comes down or a big bunch of limbs and you're trying to figure out how to process it, there is a process called hugelkultur. It's taking a bunch of down logs, and under this mound of soil right here are logs that are stacked. And so we basically created like a trench in the ground a little bit, laid down logs, and then piled soil on top of it. And then you could actually plant in that. So if you had a bunch of large, maybe you had a tree come down and you had a bunch of limbs, and one way to manage it on site instead of having to cut it up or remove it off the property is just actually help with the decomposition process here. So we put this, this was a Master Gardener project, and we put a piece of plexiglass here so that we could see the decomposition process of this particular bed. But obviously, if you're doing this in your own yard, you don't have to do that part. And so what happens is, we had the logs in there, we put the soil, we planted it, and over time it grew. And so this particular year we grew beans. We've grown nasturtiums there, lots of different things over the years. But as I said, that as the decay process of these logs are happening, nutrients in that are being released and then being taken up by the actual plants growing on top of it. So if you're interested in learning about this, again, look up the word hugelkultur, and you'll learn all different methods about on-site management for particularly decaying material, large logs, things like that. All right, with your lawns, fall is notorious for lawn care and making sure that if you do have a lawn, here's some good habits for that. There is a fact sheet on lawns, and there's about 2 or 3 pages worth of just fall lawn care tips in that. So I'm going to give you some overall arching principles, but really refer you to that other publication that will then you can go into greater detail and learn what else you need to be considering about your lawn as well. As I said earlier in the presentation, you want to rake up most of your leaves on your lawn. Do not let them pile up for long periods of time. Again, the leaves on there will damage the blades there, also harbor other types of insects and disease. And so if it's on the lawn, you really want to clean up that area. Leaving some leaves behind is okay, but again, put it in areas, maybe if it's on a perimeter on a bed, you can pile up some of the leaves onto your bed, but not necessarily onto the lawn itself. And those leaves do provide some good winter habitat for some of the insects, but you don't want it necessarily right on top of your lawn in massive amounts. For your lawn itself and cutting it, you're going to start adjusting your mower head so that by the end of October, you have your lawn to about 1.5 inches to 2 inches high. So the blades of grass should be no more than 2 inches high. And you want to do that kind of gradually and not do too much because you run the risk of scalping your lawn. And that's not obviously our ideal situation. So we want to make sure that eventually you get to that 1.5 to 2 inches high for height for that. If you do have heavy thatch or compacted soils, consider aerating your lawn, and this is a perfect time to do it here in the fall. You also want to apply a higher nitrogen fast release fertilizer. There are fast release fertilizers and slow release ones. Typically you see slow release fertilizers in, let's say, in your container plants. So that way then fertilizer is released slowly throughout the entire summer so that the blooms will continue to happen. Here for your lawns in the fall, you don't want the slow release. You want to have that be absorbed now immediately. And so by putting in nitrogen, and again, there's in our fact sheets, we also have charts on figuring out how much to need based on how much area that you have, but using a fertilizer that's high in nitrogen. So if you look at the numbers on a fertilizer label here, they measure nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, otherwise known as NPK. And so nitrogen is associated with the first number, phosphorus is the middle number, and potassium is the third number. So in this case, it would be like 3 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus to 2 parts potassium, or 6 to 1 to 4 is another way. So again, you want to have this nitrogen number be the highest number out of the fertilizer because again, you're trying to get as much nitrogen into the lawn as possible right now. The other part about fall and also in spring is that traditionally that's the best time to control your weeds. At that point, especially in the fall, the plants are looking at ways in order to transfer the carbs back down into the root zone. And so at that point, they are, it's easier to manage them. So if you are going to do any kind of weed control, this is the best time to do it. So whether you're hand doing it, or if you end up choosing to use some type of product, making sure that you read the label, follow the label directions there. But overall, weeds in the spring and the fall are more open and have a greater effect to other types of products during this time rather than in the summer or in the winter. Okay, so we're going to move on to bulbs. Bulbs definitely are varying levels of information out on the internet based on bulbs. And you'll see if you just Google, like, do I need to dig up my bulbs in the wintertime? You'll see varying responses. And that's based on the information that you get from the internet is based on where that particular author was writing that article. So here in the Pacific Northwest, our ground, especially in Western Washington, typically doesn't freeze solid. And so there are going to be things that you see on the internet that say, yes, dig up all your bulbs, your summer bulbs, like your dahlias and gladiolas, everything else, other types of bulbs as well, and then store them there. Here, it may not be necessary for all your summer bulbs to be dug up. There are ones that have higher, are prone to disease, like our dahlias, our gladiolas, and our lilies. So you want to make sure that those are ones that you may want to dig up, where there's others that you could kind of keep in the ground and they'll just be just fine. But ultimately, if you do decide for, let's say, a dahlia, you want to wait till the top growth dies back before digging them up, remove any soil around the bulb itself, clip off any remaining plant material from the bulb. And one thing that if you are into knowing what that bulb species is, you need to remember to label it at that time, because once you take out that bulb, it's really hard to determine, again, from that bulb, what the actual variety or species is. Make sure your bulbs are dry before storing. So even after you dig them and remove all the soil, just let them sit for a day or two, let them dry out completely. And then you can store them either in a shallow container of vermiculite or wood shavings. And yeah, just store them in a cool, dry location. But this time is also another great time to plant so our spring bulbs, so that way they are in the ground and ready to go, because most of the spring bulbs, they need a chilling period for them to actually set. And so that way, by putting them in the ground now, that chilling period will happen all through the winter months, and then they'll be ready to bloom next spring. There's a whole nother fact sheet on just spring bulbs and planting and all the different types and depths and how to properly do them. So again, I'm not going to go into details today, but there's plenty of information if you want to dive down to this particular subject there about planting spring bulbs. Another great, since we're on still bulbs there, I just wanted to remind everybody that a lot of times folks forget or are like, oh wait, when do I plant garlic again? Traditionally, you think, oh, I need to plant this at other times of the year, but actually planting garlic now in the fall is the best time. So make sure it's in the ground by end of October, early November. And this will give it time to develop, again, those roots throughout the winter time there. And then also, if you do late by October, November, you don't want to plant it too soon, because then it's going to start growing too soon and emerge too early next spring. So really wait until October to be planting your garlic there, early November. And that way, the proper amount of time it'll be in the ground before then you end up seeing that plant material emerge next spring in an appropriate time. So again, space the cloves 4 to 6 inches apart, and then 3 to 4 inches deep, and then plant the root side down, and then put some mulch or soil once planted over it. So, and then there again, there's a fact sheet on just growing garlic too, if you need information about that too. Okay, any questions so far about that? And then we can go into our last half of our program.
There aren't any questions, but I'm going to share the results of the poll. So it looks like a lot of people do some pruning in the fall, fertilizing lawns, planting bulbs, and then a couple people said they start new compost piles and divide and propagate plants.
Okay.
So
I am interested to see that, again, no one chose soil test. Again, it could be different methods of maintaining it. One, if you have a larger space and you really want to have do some really major changes with the amendments, it's easier if you do it now where it has time to naturally work in. You can also, another great time to do it is in the spring next year to also do a soil test, but you need to do it early enough so that you can have your amendments work into the soil before you plant. And most time, by the time you actually start to think about that, it's already too late, meaning you're too close to planting time before you're doing your soil test. So you don't want to do it so early where all your nutrients wash away through the winter time. But at the same time, you want to make sure your soil test is done early enough to make those amendments and actually have it work in before you actually it's planting time. So whether you do it in the fall or spring, just something to keep in mind about that.
Great. We did have one question come in. When can ferns be divided and replanted?
Ooh, okay. I don't necessarily know that that off the top of my head. I will keep that question, and we will, in our follow-up information, I will make sure that ferns are addressed there. I do know that I have seen that some division happen at our demonstration gardens with ferns, but I want to make sure that I don't tell you the wrong information if I don't know exactly what species and things of that. So I'll make sure I get information about that before answering that question. All right. Anything else?
No, but yeah, just a reminder to participants, if you have questions, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and hit submit, and we'll get to it at the next break.
Okay. Now, I will reference to say that, yes, I'm the program coordinator, but I am no means consider myself the expert on all things gardening. So hence the name when you say, oh, I'm master gardener. The great thing about being a master gardener is that we are lifelong learners, and that the great thing about our program is that there are so many gardeners that are part of our program that know so much. So I want to make sure that I definitely highlight their work and their knowledge, and also the resources that are provided to us that are, again, credible, good science-based information, and so that we can all become better gardeners. All right, let's move into a last couple topics here, which is harvest. I did do this presentation in August, our lunch and learn, about some tips about harvesting tips, but I do also keep in mind that harvest is still happening right now. So a couple things just to keep in mind: that if you're harvesting potatoes, make sure that you do that after the tops die down. So they shouldn't be still, fully up. If they're down laying on the ground there, that's when you can harvest your potatoes. Raspberries, there are couple different varieties, different categories of raspberries, and you want to make sure that you're pruning the proper way based on the particular kind of raspberry that you have, but also the variety. So there is a fact sheet that's all about raspberries, and there's a whole section there about pruning and how to cut back in the fall, and how to properly do that based on the varieties that you have. So I do want you to keep in mind that raspberries do need some care as well. Your caneberries do need fall care, but there's not a general rule I can give you right now. It's more specific on the type of berry that you have, and then following the proper procedure, which is, again, outlined in our fact sheets that we have. So I'll just keep that in mind, put that on your to-do list, and then do some follow-up information about that. As we also alluded, this is the only slide I stole from last month's presentation about that, is just making sure that you know what things can still ripen on the vine and which things can be ripened off the vine, particularly green tomatoes right now. If you still have green tomatoes on the vine, and the plant is still growing, you want to prune off those the green parts of the plant that maybe you might see some even flowers still on them. You want to prune those out, so that way then ultimately you just have the energy concentrated in trying to get that current tomato that's on there to get it ripened. If it comes to the point where, the nights are cold, frost is imminent there, and you still have tomatoes on the vine, you're going to harvest those tomatoes off the vine there and bring them inside. One method that works well is by putting them, let's say, in a cardboard kind of box, put some newspaper on there and putting your tomatoes on that and let them ripen on the counter. For example, if you grow melons here, a lot of the varieties that we do have need to actually mature on the vine. Watermelon isn't a big grower here in the Pacific Northwest, on the west side at least. But if you do, there are certain varieties that can be grown here. They do need to mature on the vine. Bigger doesn't always mean better. As we know, zucchinis and that can get out of control and grow, literally, it seems like overnight. So keep in mind that as the larger they get, sometimes you'll lose flavor as well. So you want to make sure you're on top of that. And when you're handling the plants, make sure that you're handling it with care, using your tools in order to pull things rather than just ripping it off the actual plant itself. And traditionally, again, harvest time is always best to do it in the morning. By doing so, it actually allows the sugars to be distributed back into the plant. And that happens overnight. So it's always best to harvest in the day. So that way you have the sweetest, let's say if you're doing fruit, the sugars have reestablished themselves back into the berries. So harvest is always best in the morning with a lot of our fruits and vegetable crops. They tend to be crispier, juicier, sweeter, all of that. One thing also to keep in mind for the fall here is if you end up having some squash growing on there or pumpkins there, you might have to do some, it's getting heavy for the vines. So you might have to put some additional support around it. Here we put like a little cement rock here or underneath it. So that way it has less soil contact, which will then help it so that it doesn't rot out in that particular area. This particular delicata squash here was a little heavy for this particular plant. So we're resting it here on the edge of our raised bed and allowing that to kind of help support that plant as it gets into its final stages of growth here. So the one critical piece, if I can give you any type of advice for your beds, is making sure that you take notes before you start cleaning out your vegetable beds. So look at all the plants and make notes about what varieties were where, how you planted them, also whether or not you liked them or not, whether or not they tasted good, whether or not they grew enough. Maybe they were prolific and they grew too much, or maybe they produced not enough for you. So it's always harder that after you've cleaned up to go back and remember, oh, what did I put there? And also helps with crop rotation for your winter planning. So if you know what your beds look like now, make sure that you make those notes now before you take anything out. So that way, then once you do take it out, then you can start to rearrange where you're going to plant things next year into your beds as a good winter activity when the seed catalogs come in and everybody's excited in January or in December. The other thing too, if you do decide to harvest seeds, this is the time to do it. So if you want to try to harvest seeds, knowing if seeds are able to be harvested, certain seeds will not produce again, others will. It just depends on what type of seed that you're planting there. So again, knowing what the particular variety it is, and then doing some research on that, whether or not those seeds can actually reproduce another plant. Sometimes with certain varieties of plants, they will produce one year of that particular variety, but then revert back to maybe another variety that it was bred with that isn't necessarily what you were looking for. So you do need to do some research on, again, what things you liked and whether or not seed harvesting is applicable and easy to do. One thing about before packing them up is that, again, you want to have those seeds dry. You don't want to have any moisture on the seeds before packing them up and securing them for the winter time here. And then also, as you're removing things too, if it's diseased, don't compost it. That's kind of the overall arching rule, whether it's perennial bed or a vegetable bed, or and that just making sure that you don't compost diseased plant material. You also want to make sure that your beds are weeded before you end up putting your whatever protected layer. Let's say if you have raised beds, you want to make sure that bed is actually weeded before you put on, in our case, we put cardboard down over the exposed soil to make sure that there's some a protective layer between the elements and the soil itself. But you don't want to have a whole bunch of weeds there and just put cardboard on top, because again, those seeds will just germinate right in that soil. Sure enough, you're going to be growing weeds next year rather than produce. This is also an opportunity time in the fall that if you want to expand your beds, well, let's say you want to kill off a little section of your lawn and make your vegetable bed a little bit larger. A great way to do it is here in the fall is called sheet mulch. And so that will naturally kill off a section of the lawn by layering compost and soil or cardboard and soil. And then eventually that area will kill the grass off, and then you'll be able to plant right in it there. So this is the fall is the perfect time to expand your beds if you're looking to expand them a little bit. And then there's a fact sheet on sheet mulching if you want to learn all about that. So here, this is kind of this was earlier in the season. The beds were already planted, but it wasn't full on because as you see, like the tomatoes plants weren't that too large here. But as they go throughout the season, they just keep on getting bigger and bigger. And so eventually this, again, all this plant material will have to be cleaned out here as it grows. So we started off with, we do square foot gardening method in our particular food bank garden bed. So again, it's pretty densely, heavily packed, but then eventually for the winter time, this is what they look like. So everything's torn out of them. The soil, it's all weeded. And then after that, it's just soil underneath. And so at that point, we put down some cardboard and some rocks. We do have drip irrigation systems that we drain out. And right now they're using, here it's early enough in the season that they're using that also to help secure the cardboard. If we have cold temperatures and then that irrigation equipment also would be taken in and removed from that. And it would just be the cardboard and the extra rocks there. But right now during the transition period, we leave these irrigation systems on for that period of time. Another thing to also keep in mind if you're wanting to do now, can I kind of get a jump start for spring, is also if you have a lot of problems with rodents underneath the beds coming up and eating your root crops there, this is another time that you could easily do this. So we also, we took the bed completely apart, put down some hardware cloth underneath it, staple gunned it to the bottom, and then now there's a wire mesh barrier between the soil and then the rest of the soil that we're going to fill in. So at the base of each of these beds is now, under the base layer is now this fine mesh there. We also decided to raise these beds up. And so the Master Gardeners group of them worked really hard in actually making them much taller by adding an additional one. And then we refilled the beds with soil. By making them a little bit higher, it's easier to garden, but also provides more distance between the soil layer, the ground, and also where the plants are growing there too. So that's another fall task if you want, or in this case, you could do it in the spring too, but spring and fall are definitely the times to be thinking about that. If you're killing off the grass, let's say we wanted, here to kill off this area, then this is where we would do it now in the fall. And that way, then all winter long, it's cooking it, killing off that area if we wanted to expand that bed. All right, our last section here is compost. So the current thing that you need to do with your compost piles, you've been, adding to them throughout the summer here. It's now time to actually sift your current piles that you have. By sifting them, you'll actually take whatever finished compost that you've been making. So for example, we started our piles in March. And so we've been adding to them, and then we stopped midsummer and just kind of let them cook for the rest of the summer here. And so now we're at a point where coming up here in September and October, we're going to be taking those piles and we're going to take that and sift out anything that's large enough that hasn't fully composted. The rest of it will then, the finished compost will fall down into, we hold it into a wheelbarrow. And then anything that's left behind that still needs to be composted, we're going to use to build new piles. It's a great time to build piles in the spring and the fall. And then you add to them throughout the growing season, but then really now the new piles we're going to cook all winter long, and then you'll have finished compost next spring when you actually need it again. So sift your current piles and you're going to make new piles. And then if you're doing worm composting, you need to winterize their beds, especially if they're outside. So we're going to take a look at that. So right now, here's our sifter that we have. It's a wood structure here. It's on chains. And then here under this wood piece here is, you can see a little bit of it here. It's kind of hardware cloth here. So this is the material that has been cooking since March, and we put it onto the screen, and then we shake it or move our hands around on top of it. Any of this finished compost, which you see is nice, brown, dark, crumbly, is going to fall through the mesh into the wheelbarrow. And then we wheel that out to the area in which we want to put the compost. And anything left behind, kind of like these larger sticks, that's what we're going to use to put back into the compost pile in order to rebuild it. And so this is one thing that we always do in the spring and the fall is sift out our current piles and make new ones. And that way they cook during our other winter off season here. Right now, you're getting a lot of green material, maybe from your perennial beds. You're cutting back a lot of things and your annual plants and your vegetable beds. So you're going to have a lot of green material, but also this is an opportune time to take advantage of the leaves, other things like that that are kind of your browns, your bulking materials. So this is the perfect time to do compost because you end up having a lot of green material, which is again your fresh vines or plants that are coming out of your vegetable beds, or the stalks that are still in your perennial beds that are still green. You can alive. That means you can take that and mix that in with some of your bulking agents, which again are your leaves, sticks, things like that. And then you make the perfect recipe. If you're interested in learning about our composting process, go to our YouTube channel. We have all kinds of videos there that explain the composting process on how to build it. And I've ultimately here this is what our end result is. We've now filled up all of our composting bins along our fence line here with all ready for winter. The only thing we're going to do is make sure that they're well watered in and that these lids come back over the top of them there. And then in the wintertime, we're going to check on them. So out there in the wintertime, we'll go in to make sure that there's still enough moisture on them and that they're cooking up. You could sift them a bit to make sure that the pile still remains hot. And eventually then those piles will start to break down. And then by next spring, you'll have finished compost that you're able to use again and put on your beds just when you need it, when the beds in the spring need that extra boost before planting. So this was our huge compost pile. Unfortunately, we were not able to compost last year. At the end of 2019, we anticipated we were able to start the process in March of 2020, but last year when COVID hit, everything stopped. So our pile it was huge. In fact, it was taller than me. And then all summer long, we've been working at getting this compost pile. Now, since we weren't in the garden all of 2020, doing these work piles, the bottom of this massive pile had already turned into finished compost. So the goal was to try to get to it so that we could sift it out. So keep in mind that compost is going to happen no matter what, but you can help speed it along if you actually by creating, a system in order to help speed the process up. Another thing to keep in mind when you're building your pile here in the fall is to start stockpiling your coffee grounds. So if you build your new piles, add in those coffee grounds, and that will also help your piles keep going all throughout the winter time. Here's our worm sorting here. So we took our worm bin here, we emptied it out here, and we're sorting out our worms and any of the castings, which is the worm poop. And we're going to use that as our fertilizer here for the fall to put that on. And then now you'll have our worms that are left behind. And then you're going to create new bedding using shredded paper to build our new beds. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we insulate our beds because our beds are outside. We lined this wood box with cardboard. This is an extra layer of insulation around that so the worms don't freeze. They will ball up and their metabolism slows in the wintertime. So you can still have you can still feed your worms, and you do need to, but not as often, just because the fact their metabolism slows in the cooler temperatures. So by adding this cardboard layer will help keep them warmer so that they don't actually die. But then in here, putting in a mixture of, you could do straw, you could do shredded paper, putting in some food source, a cup of soil, and then watering it in. And then your worms will be ready for the winter time here. And that's, again, we have more resources on our Master Recycler Composter webpage and also our YouTube channel. Okay, irrigation. This is the final task you want to do. Once you've got all your other gardening tasks done, you want to wrap up your irrigation line. So you want to make sure that when you're doing that, you're blowing out and really making sure that your pipes are all free from debris, but also making sure that they're not cracked. So you want to do a visual check of your irrigation system there. So you want to drain your lines, inspect for cracks, discard any broken or leaky parts. If you have hoses, you want to store them out of the sun. Don't hang them directly on nails. A lot of times people put a nail on the wall and hang their hose. That point of a nail to the hose, it actually will start to wear away at that hose point. So instead, I would take a piece of wood, put a coffee can, have a greater surface area for that hose to hang over rather than a single point of a hose, which is very tiny that it can eventually wear into that hose. If you have a greater surface area, like wrapping that hose over a coffee can, you won't have that same problem. Connect your hose hands together, because otherwise critters can get in there and harbor over in the winter, and that's not also good either to have them that. If you have timers, you want to make sure that you put them in a dry location, let them dry out. You don't want to store them all soaked or have a lot of water in them. And then if you have garden fountains or winterized, you want to make sure you winterize them. Otherwise, they could crack as well. Also, if you haven't set up your rain barrels, and you can do that. Typically, again, it's another option for folks of collecting water throughout the winter time off your gutters there. And there is a fact sheet on how to set up a rain barrel system. Lastly, we'll talk about is slug control. Right now, September, October, and November. I did mention this last month at harvesting video or a harvesting lunch and learn, but really it's critical right now. I'm seeing it all the time. Mating is happening right now for our slug populations. And so the damage is going to be done by matings happening means that eggs are going to be laid, and then we're going to have more, the eggs will overwinter in the winter time, and then you'll have them hatch next spring. So you want to prevent mating happening now so that you'll have less slugs in the spring. So putting out traps right now, it could be a bowl full of soapy water or beer. Slugs will be attracted to that. They'll drown in the liquid. And that way, then again, you're preventing the mating and the eggs from being laid. So our native slugs, so this is a non-native, this is a leopard slug. This is a banana slug, one of our natives. It's actually doing a great job here in the fall of actually eating up a lot of this leaf litter. So our slug population in the fall is really also doing a tremendous amount of work eating our native slugs are doing a good work of eating up a lot of this debris that, you know, if they weren't there, we would notice a difference. So a lot of times we don't see them because we see slugs are active at night. And so that's another reason why we're not necessarily seeing their work, but actually they are doing quite a bit of cleanup here while we sleep. The other thing to keep in mind, snails also do the same amount of damage. So again, these snails happen, both of them are in the evening time there, especially if you see this kind of chewing mark here, irregular shaped holes, and that's particularly, this is a bean plant. This was on the hugelkultur bed from a few slides ago. This particular beans plant was on there, and we found these snails right next to it. So the slime trail led them right to, you know, led us right to that particular problem there. So we knew it was it. The only thing I'll mention is with slug control or with snail control is that be cautious of what you read on the internet and make sure that it's applicable to the Pacific Northwest. One of the number one recommendations to manage slugs is to use diatomaceous earth, but it is not an effective slug control here in Western Washington weather. It doesn't work when it gets wet. And here, as soon as the fall rains come, it's it. So use a method that actually works better. And so just I'll warn you to make sure that whatever you're reading online, make sure that it's actually applicable to Western Washington. So yeah, that's it. And then obviously if you're using a different type of synthetic pesticide, making sure that you know what it is, read the label, but also make better choices. So there's 2 other publications that'll also be in your follow-up email that will help you make better decisions. Traditionally on our end, we just recommend, again, bait traps, which again are soapy water, dish soap and water, or beer in them. And that is, you know, does a pretty good job of managing them, especially here in the breeding season. The last thing is for spring, you want to do some work now, and that is to inventory your tools and garden supplies here in the fall. Figure out which tools you like, which things have broken, which things you have worn out. Make a list of those needed supplies. Also, it's a good way to make a list and share your gift ideas with your family members. Say, hey, I could use a new, you know, pruner. I could use a new trowel. So that's great. The other thing is if you do the bingo card for your fall tasks, you could have if somebody gets the most bingos, they could end up getting a tool, and we sell tools off of our foundation website, so that might be another option there for you as well. Shop end of the season clearance sales, stock up on seed starting supplies, and seeds. You can decide if you want to buy now on clearance or wait till next spring when the catalogs come out. Up to you. So that's another option there. Seeds typically last about 3 years or so. So if you do find a seed packet that's on sale right now that you really want, it's fine. It'll grow fine next year. But then there might be new varieties of things you want to try. So it might be a good mix to do both. All right, I think before we stop questions, I just want to review a couple things there. Again, these are all resources that are going to be available in your follow-up email, where our fact sheets are, our WSU publications, our gardening.wsu.edu has hundreds of fact sheets, our Oregon State publications. If you have disease questions, you can look at Hort Sense, Pest Sense, our Pacific Northwest handbooks. Again, all of these will be available in our follow-up email. If you have composting questions, go to our website. We have lots of resources on our webpage as well, and these will also be in your follow-up resources, as well as our Thurston County Solid Waste website that also has a lot of great follow-up information there, especially whether or not things can be recycled or not. Our virtual conference is coming up here in end of September. You don't have to be a Master Gardener to attend. Just go to mglearns.org. You can Google it, and it's again a virtual conference over September 30th through October 2nd. And our foundation also has an upcoming event here. We have a nonprofit foundation that fundraises on behalf of our program so that we have money to operate a lot of our outreach activities and events. And this coming Thursday, we have our virtual presentation by Marianne Benetti. It's on Zoom, and it's our fall fundraiser there. It costs $25 to attend. Go to mgftc.org and register before tomorrow evening. I think it's 5 o'clock on Wednesday. You need to register before then. And Marianne's presentation is always entertaining and packed full of information. So be sure to check that out. This coming Thursday night from 6:30 to 8 on Zoom, but you need to register before tomorrow. And that's again, we also have our plant sales still happening all through September and potentially into October as well. You just need to go again on our foundation website, and the shopping appointments are there. Our nursery is packed with all kinds of great perennials. Great time to plant. As we said, right now fall is a great time to plant, and this is a perfect time to take up some of those sales also happening. It's on the nursery is located on the back half of our demonstration garden in Yager Park across from Capitol Mall. Just go to our website there and to learn all about the details about how to make a shopping appointment. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for participating in our last of our summer series there for this. And again, we have our question answer clinic. You can contact us at any time if you have any follow-up questions about any of the materials there. So thank you.